Mushoku Tensei is the first isekai that I read and thought, oh, okay, this is why isekai exists. I've seen a lot of isekai in my days. You get really good ones like Konosuba or ReZero, but a majority of isekai are, unfortunately, trash. The main character enters a new world, gets godlike powers, and then receives a harem of one-dimensional anime girls. Then the fact that he's from another world never really comes into play in any meaningful way. Way back in my youth, isekai wasn't a very common theme, so when you did have an isekai, they were all pretty unique. You had things like Digimon or Inuyasha, but there was no cookie-cutter plot that you see in so many isekai nowadays. I always wondered, how did we get here? Every now and then, there's a work of fiction that is so good that others try to write something similar, some of which succeed, but most fail. Lord of the Rings is the pinnacle of fantasy fiction, and there have been a plethora of fantasy novels that took inspiration from it, but very few succeed, like The Song of Ice and Fire. Lord of the Rings was by no means the first piece of fantasy fiction, but it's definitely the most famous, and for good reason. Due to this, I thought that maybe isekai had something similar happen. Everyone is copying the same tropes from some iconic work that actually handled them effectively. So, where did they all come from? The answer? Mushoku Tensei. How is Mushoku Tensei different from other isekai? I mean, it's just being reincarnated as a Shoda in another world, right? That's what I thought when I first started reading the light novel, and boy, was I wrong. I was expecting a power fantasy adventure with the main character, Rudeus, having every member of his harem dumped on him in chapter 1 or 2. Yet instead, I was introduced to a newlywed couple, Rudeus' parents, in their small cottage. And the story stays here for quite some time. It builds the foundation for the rest of the world in its narrative. It doesn't dump exposition about how the whole world works or who exists in this world. It simply shows you a young man reborn into a new world living with his parents and a maid. By focusing on this small scale, you are introduced to what this story is about. It's not a world-saving adventure, but a story about people. Mushoku Tensei spends a lot of time developing the world and the people in it. So much so that the characters feel alive, they respond in a natural and realistic manner. When Rudeus first sees someone die for the first time, he freezes and freaks out, just as most people from our world would. But that's normal for people in this world, yet the characters don't even bat an eye at it. Most isekai fail at characterization, as most authors just assume the reader or viewer are well aware of character tropes in anime, so they just make their characters tropes instead of out to be actual people. You get the tsundere, the loli, the polar opposite twins, etc. In comparison, the entire first 2 volumes of Mushoku Tensei's light novels, the first 8 episodes of the anime, are spent entirely building up the setting of this world, the relationships between our main character and those around him, and give us insight into what kind of person the main character is, which is what this isekai is actually about. As mentioned, this isekai is not about an adventure. Yes, an adventure does happen in it, but that's not the plot. It is in service to the actual plot, the plot of the redemption of Rudeus Greyrat. Rudeus is not a good person. He has awful opinions about other people. There was a bit of a controversy about this, which I will get into in a bit, but I need to explain some things first. Mushoku Tensei is a story about redemption. Rudeus is the main character because of how terrible of a person he is when he was reincarnated into this world. Rudeus is from our world. He behaves the way he does because of how he was in our world. Many isekai protagonists enter the world in episode 1, and then the fact that they're from another world never really comes into play again in any compelling manner. But Mushoku Tensei is completely about Rudeus overcoming who he was in his previous life. In his previous life, Rudeus was a disgusting shut-in who leeched off his parents for 20 years due to him being horrendously bullied in high school. He degraded so much as a person that, despite the life his parents were letting him live, when they passed away, he refused to even go to their wake. Instead, he chose to give his Oliver a twist while watching uncensored cultured loli anime. When his siblings showed up to find out why he didn't come, no pun intended, they were disgusted by him and kicked him out of the house. And who wouldn't be disgusted with this protagonist? He doesn't exactly do anything to endear himself to the audience. He's a degenerate who constantly harasses women, seeing them as nothing but a means to vent his sexual frustrations with. He doesn't even really view other people as being individuals, seeing them more as a pawn to be used for his own purposes. So why would I possibly be making this video trying to convince people to get into Mushoku Tensei? Because, as I mentioned, Mushoku Tensei is about redemption. I have to stress this point. He has to be redeemed because who he is completely unacceptable. You're not supposed to like him, but you're supposed to cheer for him trying to change. The author, Orihujin Maganote, stated it best. Rudeus's mountain of regrets from his first life is what makes him redoing his life more meaningful. The further a person has fallen, the more compelling their journey towards redemption is. I know most isekai characters are one-dimensional, static characters. They never change from how they're first introduced. But even though it shares many of the tropes, many of which are famous because of Mushoku Tensei is different from most isekai. You have to go into the show understanding that Rudeus is a terrible person. The story will tell you that quite early on. But understand, it's merely setting the stage for the actual narrative. It's not condoning his behavior. In fact, it's doing quite the opposite. He has to change because the way he acts is entirely unacceptable. The story starts as it does because it wants you to see where Rudeus starts as a person. And now that you know where he is, you can watch his journey to see where he goes. He can start growing and become a better person now. Spoiler alert, but Rudeus grows substantially by the end of the first season of the anime. He still has a lot to grow, but at least his views become much more healthy. It is my belief that Mushoku Tensei is the most human of isekai. Every character feels like someone you could actually imagine being a real person. The conflicts that arise in the show are completely believable, and each conflict is meaningful. It shows who these characters are, what motivates them, what their personalities are like, how the world operates, and gives them opportunities for growth. While most isekai like to dump exposition on the viewer, that very rarely happens in Mushoku Tensei. Everything is done in an extremely organic manner. Rudeus' father, Paul, is a sleazebag. He's a philanderer who constantly hits on women, which seems to be this man's highest priority in life, at least until he ends up knocking up one of his fellow adventurers, Zenith. Despite being such a womanizer, he decided to take responsibility and married her. So even though he's not exactly a person who you should model your life around, he does have some redeeming qualities to him. He's not the archetype of a perverted man, but that also doesn't mean he just stopped being a womanizer completely. While he does his best not to cheat on his wife, he still ends up getting seduced by his housemaid and getting her pregnant as well. But rather than lie about it, he admits it and tries to take responsibility. He's not a good guy, but the way he acts just makes you at least have some respect for him. He's not completely hopeless. And it's very rare for an isekai to write a character like this. Usually this type of character would be a one-off villain with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. But Paul has multiple dimensions to his personality. Similarly, Rudeus does too. I've already given the rundown of Rudeus' personality at the start of Mushoku Tensei, but the plot is all about his redemption. Rudeus grows over the course of the narrative. That's literally what the narrative is about. I have to mention this, because back when Season 1 was airing, I saw many people talking about how this show is awful because it promotes pedophilia, grooming, or sexism, and I just can't accept that viewpoint. I don't understand how someone can watch Mushoku Tensei and come to that conclusion. I feel like a lot of people saw someone on Twitter make the claim, and then they just jumped on the bandwagon, but that belief still had to come from somewhere. Just because it shows something does not mean it's condoning it. If that's not something you can understand, then I can't recommend Mushoku Tensei to you. I can understand how certain scenes can put people off. I can understand why people would drop the show due to those scenes. But claiming that the show is promoting these things is what I have an issue with. Rudeus is a terrible person early on, that's the point. The fact that he's doing these things is the show going, hey, this person is terrible, and this is why he needs to change, because the things he does are unacceptable. If the series was glorifying any of this, then why does the series actively try and get Rudeus to change to become a more socially acceptable person? Maybe you don't like how long it takes for him to start becoming less horny, but he has 20 years of his hikikomori life that he has to unlearn. His only experience with the women and people in general was from the internet. His only experience with dating was through dating sims. The last 20 years of his life was spent not interacting with real people, and that's the entire reason why he is such a bad person, and why redoing his life is meaningful to begin with. After all, you can't make a redemption story without a protagonist that needs to be redeemed. The author made the best statement about this in my opinion. In Japanese creative works, there are two polar opposite approaches to depicting sexual life, as sacred or as pleasure. I suppose I got my inspiration because I thought there wasn't enough representation of the viewpoint that reproductive activity is natural to organisms. I think that, among the instincts of a living creature, the urge to breed is the strongest even when put alongside the urge to eat. Most living creatures will generally live their lives driven by the natural desire to leave offspring behind. That inevitably goes hand in hand with sexual activity. Basically, it's a natural and important aspect of being a living creature. Because it's an important aspect of the life of an organism, it's not wrong to call it sacred. However, it's also true that sex is associated with pleasure. You can also say that it's natural for people to treat sex as pleasure for as long as pleasure is intertwined with the act. With that in mind, when depicting the world of Mushoku Tensei, I aimed for the middle ground between sacred and pleasure. That's the vibe I was going for. Incidentally, when writing the opening act of the story, I strongly emphasized Rudeus' perspective on sex as a thing of pleasure. It's only natural because he has no experience in his previous life, so the pleasure aspect was the only side he came into contact with. Consequently, there might be a lot of people who strongly feel the pleasurable side. But that shouldn't be a surprise. You don't broadcast something sacred for all eyes to see. That's where Rudeus begins. That's certainly not where he ends. Mushoku Tensei is focused on exploring that growth. It takes time, but everything it does builds up the world and the characters in a meaningful way that helps serve its narrative. Rudeus' growth is slow, but that's understandable, as you don't unlearn 20 years of antisocial behavior in the blink of an eye. He doesn't realize it, and neither the anime nor light novel explicitly state this, but he has essentially blocked himself from forming emotional connections with others, and it takes quite some time before he ever lets people into his life again. You watch Rudeus grow slowly over the course of the narrative. You watch him as he comes to face the trauma he experienced in his previous life, and you watch him conquer it. He sets out to become better than who he was, even if his idea about how to do that isn't entirely correct in the beginning. The fact that he's battling with whom he was in his previous life and trying to overcome that is what makes this isekai so compelling. That's why I believe Mushoku Tensei succeeds where so many isekai fail. The side of him that wants to change is constantly at odds with the side of him that never stopped being a permanently horny teenage boy. It's only when he starts letting people in that he truly starts to grow, that the part of him that wants to change begins to win over the part of him that lives in lust. While he was working hard and learning magic, it was only when his teacher Roxy forced him to finally leave that he was able to take the first step in truly changing who he was. Only by accidentally hurting his first friend his own age does he understand that his actions have consequences, and he can force those that he cares about against him. Incidentally, this happens twice when he begins to develop feelings for another girl, Rudeus Greyrat. This one is even worse than what happened with Sylphie, as Rudeus was actually developing feelings for her. It was the first time he had ever had a girl he actually liked and almost pushed her out of his life completely. From here, Rudeus uses this specific moment to rein in his horny side. He becomes significantly less of a pervert starting from this part because he wants to be the kind of person his crush could rely on. I do think the light novel goes into this a bit better than the anime, but the anime still did a very good job on it in my opinion. The scene in question will make you feel uncomfortable though, so please be warned about that. I don't have a very good segue for this, and I had a lot that I wanted to talk about in regards to the anime specifically that I didn't know how to fit naturally into this video, so I'll just mention it here from now. Mushoku Tensei has an amazing animation on par with many high-end OVAs or actual anime films. It does this on an episode-to-episode basis. There are times where it uses traditional animation, but then they add amazing effects to enhance the visuals. The openings for each episode are actually part of the episode rather than what amounts to an AMV. This is especially notable later in the anime when the opening is used to show the journey Rudeus, Ryujerd, and Eris are going through. It shows their training and making progress on their adventure without affecting runtime, and makes the opening a joy to watch each time, as it's brand new each episode. And one final thing I love about the anime is that this world has multiple species with their own language systems. In the anime, when Rudeus and Eris end up in the Demon Continent, they actually created a fake language for the voice actors to speak just for the purpose of making the anime more authentic. I've never seen an anime with such care given to it. You could feel the love the creators of the anime had for the source material, and their work deserves to have that notoriety. Mushoku Tensei is surprisingly deep and emotional. The world is fantastical and feels alive. The characters actually feel like people, and at the end of the day, it tells a surprisingly human story. If you are the most debased individual in the world, even you can be redeemed. Even you can change. It's never too late. All you need is to take that first step. I've probably written the script completely from scratch about 5 times, trying to put into words what I wanted to say about Mushoku Tensei. I still haven't talked about everything I wanted to. All that stuff I mentioned about why the anime specifically is amazing was going to be a large part of this video in and of itself, but after trying to cut this video down to just the parts that I felt were most important, that was one of the parts I had to cut down. I knew I didn't want to make another 2.5 hour long video over something again, and decided if I ever wanted to talk about it more, I could just make more videos about it instead of trying to cram everything into this video. If you have anything that you wish I had mentioned or gone over, please mention it in the comments below. I will most likely make another Mushoku Tensei video, so I may bring up your suggestion in it. With that said, thank you for watching this video and I hope you enjoyed it. If you do know anybody who rejected Mushoku Tensei without fully understanding what it was trying to do, then maybe send them this video? I don't want you to force Mushoku Tensei onto them, but I do want those who dropped Mushoku Tensei at the beginning, or those who never tried watching it to begin with due to what they heard about it, to at least see that there is a reason why people love it. It's definitely not for everyone, but I don't want people to reject it without realizing what the story was trying to do. Again, thank you for watching, and maybe I'll see you next video.